To Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest Edition, Chapter 4, Part 2. As a note, there are racial slurs in this part of the text. I will not be reading those. I will be editing them out. It is important that they're in the text and we can see how they are being used and by who. The full meaning of the night's event hit me after I went to bed, and I began crying. Jim heard me, and for once he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. He took me to his room and put me in bed beside him. "Try to go to sleep," he said. "It'll all be over after tomorrow, maybe." Next morning, Aunt Alexandra radiated waves of disapproval at breakfast. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace of the family. But Atticus rumpled Jim's hair, his one gesture of affection, and said he was right glad his disgraces had come along. Then he pushed out his chair. "Jim, I don't want you and Scout downtown today, please." As Atticus departed, Dill came over, and after breakfast we went out to the front porch. It was like Saturday. People from the south end of the county were passing our house in a steady stream. A wagon load of ladies rattled past in cotton sunbonnets with dresses with long sleeves. A bearded man in a wool hat drove them. "Yonder's some Mennonites," Jim said to Dill. "The men can't shave after they're married. Their wives like for 'em to tickle 'em with their beards." Mr. X. Billups rode by on a mule and waved to us. "He's a funny man," said Jim. "X is his name, not his initial. He says that's the way his folks signed him up when he was born." As the county went by us, Jim told Dill about the rest of the more prominent figures. Mr. Tinsall Jones voted the straight prohibition ticket. Miss Emily Davis dipped snuff. Mr. Jake Slade was cutting his third set of teeth. Miss Maudie came out on the porch of her newly built house, and we strolled over. "You going to court this morning?" asked Jim. "I am not," she said. "It's morbid, watching a poor devil on trial for his life." "They have to try him in public, Miss Maudie," I said. "Wouldn't be right if they didn't." "Just because it's public, I don't have to go, do I?" she said. We obeyed Atticus until noon, when he came home to dinner and said they'd spent the morning picking the jury. But after dinner, when he had left, we stopped by for Dill and went to town. It was a gala occasion. Mules and wagons were parked under every available tree. The courthouse square was covered with picnic parties, washing down biscuit and syrup with warm milk from fruit jars. Some people were gnawing on cold chicken and cold fried pork chops. In a far corner of the square, the Negroes sat quietly, dining on sardines, crackers, and the more vivid flavors of knee-high cola. "Hey, look," Jim said suddenly. Some invisible signal had made the lunchers on the square rise. Children came to mothers, babies were cradled on hips as men in sweat-stained hats collected their families and herded them through the courthouse doors. The Negroes stood up, dusted their breeches, and waited patiently to go through the doors behind the white families. "We better wait till everyone's in," Jim said. "Atticus won't like it if he sees us." The Macomb County Courthouse was an early Victorian structure with a big 19th century clock tower that housed a rusty, unreliable instrument. To reach the courtroom on the second floor, one passed sunless county cubbyholes. The tax assessor, the tax collector, the county clerk, and other officials lived in cool, dim hutches that smelled of decaying record books and old damp cement. We knew there would be a crowd, but we had not bargained for the multitudes in the first floor hallway. I got separated from Jim and Dill and found myself in the midst of the Idlers Club, a group of white-shirted, suspendered old men who spent their days on the benches under the live oaks on the square. They were attentive critics of courthouse business. "Thinks he knows what he's doing," one said. "Oh, now I wouldn't say that," said another. "Atticus Finch is a deep reader, a mighty deep reader. Anyway, you know the court appointed him to defend Tom Robinson." "Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it." The Negroes, having waited for the white people to go upstairs, began to come in as the Idlers Club began its stiff-jointed climb up the stairs. When everyone was in, I finally located Jim and Dill with Reverend Sykes. There wasn't a seat on the main floor, but he had found 4 for us in the front row of the balcony of the courtroom. "Reckon that's all right?" he asked, and we said, "Gosh, yes." The colored balcony ran along 3 walls of the courtroom, like a second-story veranda, and from it we could see everything. Jury sat to the left under long windows. Sunburned, lanky, they seemed to be all farmers, but this was natural. Townsfolk rarely sat on juries. They were either struck or excused. One or two of the jury looked vaguely like dressed-up Cunninghams. The circuit solicitor and another man, Atticus and Tom Robinson, sat at tables with their backs to us. Just inside the railing that divided the spectators from the court, the witnesses sat on cowhide bottom chairs. Their backs were also to us. Judge Taylor was on the bench, looking like a sleepy old shark. Amiable, white-haired, ruddy-faced, he was a man who ran his court with an alarming informality. He sometimes propped his feet up. He often cleaned his fingernails with his pocket knife. He was a man learned in the law, and although he seemed to take his job casually, in reality, he kept a firm grip on any proceedings that came before him. The witness stand was to the right of Judge Taylor, and when we got to our seats, Mr. Heck Tate, the sheriff, was already on it. Mr. Tate, dressed for the occasion in a business suit, was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor, Mr. Gilmer. A balding, smooth-faced man, Mr. Gilmer could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. "In your own words, Mr. Tate," he was saying. "Well," said Mr. Tate, speaking to his knees, "I was fetched by Bob, by Mr. Ewell yonder, on the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office when Mr. Ewell came in. Excited he was, and said, 'Get out to his house quick. Some man had raped his girl.' So I went there as fast as I could." "And what did you find?" "Found her lying on the floor in the front room. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson." Judge Taylor looked up as if he were expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. "Asked her if he beat her like that, and she said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in." "Thank you," said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, "Any questions, Atticus?" "Yes," said my father. He was sitting behind his table, his legs were crossed, and one arm was resting on the back of his chair. "Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor?" "No, sir," said Mr. Tate. "Why not?" There was an edge to Atticus's voice. "Well, it wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened. It was obvious." "But you didn't call a doctor?" "No, sir." Judge Taylor broke in. "He's answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor." Atticus said, "I just wanted to make sure, Judge." The judge smiled. "Sheriff, you say she was mighty banged up. In what way?" "Well, she was beaten around the head. There was bruises on her arms, and she had a black eye coming." "Which eye?" Mr. Tate blinked and ran his hands through his hair. "Let's see," he said softly. Then he pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, "Her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember she was bunged up on the right side of her face." Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. He turned his head and looked around at Tom Robinson. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. "Sheriff, please repeat what you said." "It was her right eye," I said. "She was bunged up on the right side of the face. Her arms were bruised too, and her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet." Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge. Mr. Tate rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. "Robert E. Lee Ewell," the clerk boomed, and a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. His nose was thin, pointed and shiny, and he had no chin to speak of. "So help me God," he crowed. Every town had families like the Ewells. No economic fluctuations changed their status. They lived as guests of the county in prosperity as well as in the depths of a depression. No truant officer could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health defender could free them from congenital defects and the diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. Maycomb's Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin, its plank walls supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron. its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls. The Ewells gave the dump a thorough gleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. The yard contained the remnants of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, and an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, and picture frames. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some said 6, others 9. There were always several dirty faces at the windows when anyone passed by. A dirt road ran past their cabin to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbors was that, if scrubbed with lye soap in very hot water, his skin was white. "Mr. Robert Ewell?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "That's my name, Cap'n," said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmer's witness, and he had no business being rude to him of all people. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" was the next question. "Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead," was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly and looked at the witness. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" he asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. "Now let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subjects from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand?" Mr. Ewell nodded, and Judge Taylor said, "All right, Mr. Gilmer." "Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you tell us, just in your own words, what happened on the evening of November 21st, please?" Jim grinned and pushed his hair back. "Just in your own words" was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid his witness might employ. "Well, the night of November 21, I was coming from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house." "What time was it, Mr. Ewell?" "Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was saying, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and ran as fast as I could up to the window, and I seen—" Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. "I seen that man yonder on my Mayella." Judge Taylor had to use his gavel for fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench saying something to him. Sheriff Tate stood in the middle aisle quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us, there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me, pulling at Jim's elbow. "Mr. Jim," he said, "you better take Miss Jean Louise home. Mr. Jim, you hear me?" Jim turned his head. "Scout, Dill, you and Scout go home." I remembered Atticus's blessed dictum. "You gotta make me." Jim scowled furiously at me, then said to Reverend Sykes, "I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it." I was mortally offended. "I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can." "Oh, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend." Reverend Sykes' black eyes were anxious. "Mr. Finch know you all are here?" Jim shook his head. "It's all right, Reverend." As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell sat smugly surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, slowly hypnotized by gavel taps, lessening in intensity, until the only sound in the courtroom was a dim pink, pink, pink. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing. "There has been a request," Judge Taylor said, "that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, a request that will be denied for the time being. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. Moreover, you won't leave it until the whole lot of you come before me on contempt charges. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer." "You say you saw the room from the window?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "Yes, sir," said Bob Ewell. "How did the room look?" Well, it was all slung about like there was a fight. What did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the door just ahead of me. I was too distracted to run after him. I run in the house and Mayella was lying on the floor squalling. Then what did you do? Why, I run for Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was all right, lived down yonder. Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. Just a minute, sir, said Atticus genially. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell backed up into the witness chair and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion. Mr. Ewell, Atticus began, folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the window, you ran into the house, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor? Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand, said Atticus. Didn't you think, in view of Mayella's injuries, that she should have a doctor immediately? The witness said he never thought of it. He had never called a doctor for any of his in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. That all? He asked. Not quite, said Atticus casually. Mr. Ewell, you heard everything Sheriff Tate said, didn't you? Mr. Ewell considered the matter carefully and seemed to decide that the question was safe. Yes. Do you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries? How's that? Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten around the... Oh, yeah, said the witness. I hold with everything Tate said. You do? Asked Atticus mildly. I just want to make sure. He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it were stock market quotations. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember she was bunged up on the right side of her face. Thank you, Bert, said Atticus. You heard it again, Mr. Ewell. Do you agree with the sheriff? I holds with Tate. Her eye was blacked, and she was mighty beat up. The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. His chest swelled, and once more he was a red little rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. Mr. Ewell, can you read and write? Mr. Gilmer interrupted. Objection, he said. Can't see what witness's literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial. Judge Taylor was about to speak, but Atticus said, Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see. All right, said Judge Taylor, but make sure we see, Atticus. Overruled. I'll repeat, said Atticus. Can you read and write? I most positively can. Will you write your name and show us? I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks? Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. There were chuckles below us. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he'd gone frog-sticking without a light. Never, never on cross-examination ask a witness a question you don't know the answer to was a tenet I had absorbed with my baby food. Atticus produced an envelope and a fountain pen and handed them to the witness. Would you write your name for us? He asked. Clearly now, so the jury can see you do it. Mr. Ewell wrote on the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him, and Mr. Gilmer half sitting, half standing at his table. What's so interesting? He asked. You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell, said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a God-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. He had told them what happened, and he'd say it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story. Atticus finally dismissed him. Jim was pounding on the balcony rail softly. We've got him, he whispered. I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show that Mr. Ewell could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If she was beaten on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. But Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too.